I want to see Canada and Mexico do well, but the problem is we don't need their product. We don't need cars made in Canada. We don't need cars made in Mexico. We want to make them here.
Trump has bashed the USMCA, or whatever we want to call it, before, but this was in front of U.S. automakers.
Donald Trump has opened a new front in the North American trade fight, and this time he's aiming directly at Canada's auto sector. His declaration that America no longer needs Canadian cars, or even the CUSMA framework that supports the continent's integrated supply chains, may sound decisive, but when you peel back the politics, the economics tell a very different story. Trump's attack arrives at the worst possible moment for the United States, just as the CUSMA renewal approaches and North America's auto ecosystem is already under stress. What looks like a show of strength from Washington may, in reality, be a warning shot that loops back toward Detroit. Trump delivered his remarks while touring an auto plant in Michigan, telling reporters that America doesn't need cars made in Canada and that the CUSMA agreement is irrelevant. It was a familiar message, but this time it landed differently. The United States is heading into a major trade review in 2026, and tension is already running high across the border. In Windsor alone, more than 20,000 workers depend on the cross-border movement of parts and engines. Many of the components built in Ontario end up inside best-selling American vehicles, including the F-150. Those engines and components cross the border several times before final assembly. It's a system designed around predictability, not political improvisation. The timing is equally important. Prime Minister Mark Carney is expanding diplomatic and industrial ties with Asia, and his government has been sending a clear message ever since U.S. tariffs intensified in 2025. Canada will not remain economically reliant on a single partner forever. As Trump escalates his rhetoric, the two countries are drifting toward diverging economic strategies, whether they intend to or not. When Trump says the United States no longer needs Canadian auto production, he's not just contradicting industry experts, he is contradicting the very companies standing beside him. American automakers know that the integrated supply chain they rely on cannot be rebuilt overnight. Ontario hosts some of the most advanced tool and die operations in the world. The Midwest supplies steel and components. Mexico finishes what neither country alone can competitively produce. Pull one piece out of that system and the entire machine starts to seize. This is why the industry spent years telling policymakers that the North American model should be strengthened, not dismantled. Despite political speeches promising job repatriation, the data shows that manufacturing employment in the U.S. tends to fall after major tariff shocks. Companies hold back on investments when policy becomes unpredictable. The auto sector in particular depends on decade-long planning cycles, not month-to-month tariff threats. Trump may claim that pressure on Canada will reroute production back into American plants, but history shows that the real effect is hesitation, delays, and higher costs that ultimately make North American vehicles less competitive globally. And the risk deepens when you look closely at the 2026 review itself. CUSMA was designed to force all three countries back to the table every 6 years, precisely because supply chains evolve. But the review also gives Canada and Mexico a chance to rewrite rules if the United States is viewed as an unreliable partner. If Washington pushes too far, it may unintentionally trigger a coordinated Canada-Mexico front that demands stricter dispute settlement protections, tougher labor value safeguards, or even new energy trade guarantees. In that scenario, Trump's threats don't strengthen America's hand, they reduce it, because allies who once negotiated cautiously now feel justified in seeking structural protections against U.S. volatility. The backfire is not theoretical, it's built into the architecture of the agreement. There's also a fundamental contradiction in Trump's argument. Canada is the #1 export market for U.S. vehicles. If Canada stops buying American cars, the damage lands immediately in the American Midwest. That's why auto executives are increasingly vocal, stressing that the U.S. needs stability if it wants to compete with Europe's rapidly scaling EV industry or Asia's sophisticated supply chains. For every punch Washington throws northward, the economic bruise often appears at home. And Canada is no longer standing still. Carney's government has been aggressively widening its industrial partnerships. Ottawa is deepening ties with South Korea and Japan on EV batteries, defense manufacturing, and clean tech cooperation. European companies are investing more heavily in Canadian hydrogen and renewable energy sectors. Even the possibility of calibrated cooperation with China, despite political complexities, underscores that Canada is actively seeking balance in a world where supply chains are becoming more regional and less dependent on any single partner. This diversification diversification changes the negotiation map heading into the 2026 CUSMA review. In 2018, Canada arrived at the table with limited alternatives and overwhelming reliance on U.S. market access. Today, Canada has new corridors of investment, new export routes, and a clearer national strategy around critical minerals, EV components, and energy infrastructure. Trump's assumption that Canada will simply absorb pressure because it always has is now outdated. Ottawa has options, Ottawa has leverage, and Ottawa has already begun to use it. Meanwhile, the global context is shifting in ways that complicate Washington's strategy. Europe is accelerating clean tech industrial policy. South Korea and Japan are positioning themselves as indispensable suppliers of batteries, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing materials. India is entering the global EV race with scale. If the U.S. destabilizes the North American auto sector at the very moment competitors are consolidating power, American companies will struggle to keep up. A fractured supply chain is exactly what rivals hope for. The irony is that the political impact may hit Michigan first. The state's economic revival depends on an uninterrupted flow of Canadian engines, parts, and tooling. Thousands of American jobs rely on Canadian production capacity, just as Canadian workers rely on U.S. assembly lines. When Trump dismisses CUSMA as irrelevant, he is dismissing the architecture that keeps manufacturing towns across the Midwest alive. Economically, it's a risky bluff. Strategically, it's self-inflicted uncertainty. And heading into 2026, it could become a pivotal miscalculation.
Trump's attack on Canadian auto production sets the tone for a high-stakes trade confrontation. But beneath the headlines lies a deeper reality. America's automotive strength has always depended on Canada's stability and cooperation. If Washington pushes too hard, Canada will continue doing exactly what it is doing now, diversifying, partnering, and positioning itself to weather an unpredictable neighbor. The United States can choose to maintain the integrated system that has made North America's auto industry competitive for generations, or it can choose a path that weakens its own industrial base and opens the door for Europe and Asia to surge ahead. The question heading into the CUSMA review is simple. Will the U.S. embrace strategy or more political theater? Because if this confrontation escalates, the next decisive move may not be made in Washington. It may be made in Ottawa.
What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state.
Well, look, I have a great relationship with Canada. They're very tough traders, but I have a very good relationship with the Prime Minister and with Canada.
You had said you would halt those negotiations earlier after the tariff.
Well, I have halted them.
And so will you restart that?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, the problem is Canada makes a lot of things that we don't need because we make them also.
Canada is angry. Not mildly irritated, not quietly disappointed, but genuinely, openly, unmistakably angry. And what surprises Washington most is that this anger isn't weakening Canada, it's hardening it, it's clarifying it, and it's beginning to corner Donald Trump at the exact moment he thought he had all the leverage. This is the story of an unexpected shift in North America, how a furious Canadian public, a recalibrated government, and months of escalating U.S. pressure have combined into a moment the United States can no longer brush aside. It started with a simple question circulating across newsrooms, polls, and online debates. How pissed off are Canadians at Trump and the U.S. right now? The answer, it turns out, is extremely, and with good reason. Over the past year, Canada has taken hit after hit from Washington. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, and critical minerals. Accusations over digital policies. Public threats of more penalties after Ontario Premier Doug Ford aired an ad quoting Ronald Reagan on the dangers of protectionism, an ad that somehow managed to infuriate the President of the United States. And hovering over everything is the looming possibility that Trump may walk away from the USMCA just weeks before the trade deal heads into its mandatory January review. Then came the 51st state joke, Trump's favorite jab, revived again in early fall. Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, ended that quickly with one of the cleanest diplomatic shutdowns in recent memory. I've consulted the owners. They're not interested. The moment landed like a national sigh of relief. Finally, someone had said it plainly. Amid all this tension, something deeper has been shifting. Canadians aren't just upset, they're reevaluating the entire relationship with the United States. And in doing so, they're giving their government a rare gift, the political space to push back. For decades, Canadian frustration with American politics came and went in cycles, usually polite, usually short-lived. Not this time. Today, frustration has hardened into a durable sentiment that the U.S., under Donald Trump, is no longer a reliable partner. Travel to the U.S. from Canada has dropped noticeably. Conversations in business circles, universities, and town halls have taken on a new tone, one that blends disappointment with resolve. This shift matters because it changes the political landscape in Ottawa. A Canadian Prime Minister no longer risks backlash for standing firm against Washington. In fact, the opposite is true. Canadians expect their leaders to draw lines. Trump did not just irritate voters, he awakened their sense of national self-respect. This is the part Washington overlooked. Trump may love the theater of announcing tariffs or threatening to rip up trade agreements, but behind the theatrics lies a basic reality. The United States needs Canada far more than his rhetoric suggests. The U.S. relies on Canadian heavy crude that American refineries are specifically tuned to process. Almost 500,000 American farmers depend on the fertilizers shipped south from Saskatchewan. The country's nuclear plans hinge on supply chains now dominated by Canadian-backed companies. And when it comes to critical minerals, the resources that will define the next generation of industry, Canada is one of the few democratic nations with reserves large enough to match rising demand. So, while Trump raises tariffs, Canada's essential role doesn't disappear, it becomes more obvious. Even in the sectors hit hardest by U.S. measures, Canadian exports have not collapsed, they have adjusted. In some cases, global demand has even strengthened Canada's position. The anger that once reflected vulnerability now reflects confidence. Trump wanted Canada on its heels. Instead, Canada is discovering how much leverage it actually has. Tariffs make for strong campaign lines, especially in Trump's political universe. The problem is that they also reshape supply chains, raise costs, and disrupt production, especially in industries as deeply integrated as autos, construction, and energy. American manufacturers are already reporting higher input costs. Some are warning that they may not survive another year of unpredictable tariff policy. And the irony is, these are the very companies Trump promised to protect. Canada, meanwhile, continues trading, diversifying, and adapting. Without firing a shot, it is outmaneuvering an American strategy that relies more on drama than detail. It's the quietest checkmate imaginable, the kind Trump never notices until it's on the board. Mark Carney walked into office earlier this year with a message that startled many. The old relationship with the United States is over. Not the friendship, not the security partnership, but the era of automatic alignment, gone. And he acted accordingly. Under Carney, Canada has moved with unusual speed to open new markets, strengthen ties with Asia, expand partnerships for energy, nuclear technology, and advanced manufacturing, and reinvest heavily in national defense and critical infrastructure. All of this sends one message to Washington. Canada is no longer treating the United States as an anchor. It is treating it as one partner among many. And Canadians approve. For once, public sentiment and federal strategy are moving in the same direction. Trump assumed Canada would blink. Instead, Canada is staring back. He assumed tariffs would force concessions. Instead, they revealed how vulnerable American supply chains are without Canada. He assumed Canadians would eventually back down. Instead, the backlash is now shaping national policy. And perhaps most surprising to the White House, when Trump threatened new tariffs after Ford's Reagan ad, he never followed through. The threat fizzled. Ottawa didn't cave, and everyone watching noticed exactly who blinked first. As the USMCA review approaches, Trump now faces a Canada that is confident, cohesive, and backed by a public no longer willing to be treated as an afterthought. So, how angry are Canadians? Angry enough to stop assuming the United States will behave like an ally. Angry enough to demand a new footing in the relationship.
angry enough to accelerate a diversification strategy that weakens U.S. leverage, and angry enough to walk into USMCA 2026 ready for a fair negotiation, or a tough one if that's what Washington chooses. The real story isn't the anger itself. The real story is what the anger has produced: a Canada that is more self-assured, more strategic, and more willing to assert its place in North America. And as Trump prepares for a make-or-break trade review in January, he now faces a question he didn't expect. What happens when a once polite Canada finally calls his bluff and has the unity, the leverage, and the strategy to win the confrontation he started?
You know, that's just an ongoing thing. It expires in about a year, and we'll either let it expire or we'll maybe work out another deal with Mexico and Canada. But look, Mexico and Canada have taken advantage of the United States, like just about every other country. In all fairness, it's not them. I'm not blaming them.
And we just heard some fresh comments from U.S. President Donald Trump about where he stands. The trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico is up for review next year.
Donald Trump has once again threatened to blow up the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, but this time something is different. Canada didn't flinch. While Washington under Trump drifts into uncertainty, from tariff fights to lawsuits to open talk of abandoning major trade frameworks, Canada suddenly looks like the stable anchor of North America. Investors are noticing. Capital is slowly drifting north, supply chains are recalibrating, and Ottawa finds itself with leverage Trump never expected. At a high-profile hearing in Washington, senior U.S. trade officials signaled that President Trump may let CUSMA expire in 2026, or even withdraw unilaterally. Reuters added that the White House is seriously evaluating a year-to-year replacement, or even splitting USMCA into two separate deals, one with Canada, one with Mexico. Trump repeated his familiar line: "We'll either let it expire or work out another deal." Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was in Washington for a FIFA event, did not treat the comment like a crisis. His government simply reiterated that Canada would protect its interests calmly and methodically. Mexico, meanwhile, made clear it wants an early USMCA review to restore investment confidence after a turbulent year, and from Ottawa's perspective, any renegotiation must be trilateral, because a fragmented North America only serves Washington's interests, not its partners. Trump's approach hasn't changed since NAFTA was renegotiated: create uncertainty, push markets to panic, and force trading partners to beg for stability. It worked 8 years ago when Canada was more dependent on U.S. access and less confident on the global stage. But the world of 2025 is not the world of 2017. The U.S. economy is wrestling with inflation, volatile markets, and an internal industrial backlash against open-ended tariffs. Major retailers, including Costco, are openly challenging Trump's tariff authority in U.S. courts. Agricultural exporters are warning about retaliatory pain, and Republican governors privately signal mounting discomfort with another prolonged trade war. In this climate, Trump's threats don't land the way they used to. When he says he can walk away, Canada now understands something critical: Washington no longer projects the stability required to sustain its leverage. The real headline this week was not Trump's threat, but Canada's refusal to react emotionally. Carney's team projected a message that resonated far beyond Ottawa. Canada will not negotiate from fear, and it will not act like a country desperate for American permission. Analysts made the point bluntly: if Canada signals it wants the deal at any cost, it gives up every ounce of bargaining power. The Carney government appears fully aware of this. Canada existed before NAFTA, it survived the Trump trade wars of the past decade, and it continues building export pathways that soften dependence on a single market. More importantly, Canada's modern industrial strategy, from clean energy to critical minerals and AI, now attracts global partners who value predictability over chaos. Trump expected Ottawa to scramble. Instead, he ran into something he rarely encounters: a confident, steady counterpart. A subtle but powerful development is unfolding beneath the surface. Trump's advisors have openly discussed splitting USMCA into two deals so the U.S. becomes the central hub of North American trade. If that happened, any company that wants access to all three markets would have to locate inside the United States. But the past few weeks revealed that Canada and Mexico are far less willing to be separated than Trump imagined. Ottawa and Mexico City now share the same assessment. Trilateralism is essential. Fragmentation benefits only the U.S., while unity restrains Washington's ability to dictate terms. For Trump, this is the least favorable configuration. His entire negotiating playbook relies on isolating counterparties and pressuring them individually. A coordinated Canada-Mexico front blocks that approach and forces Washington to confront a reality it would prefer to ignore. Power in North America is more balanced than it appears. Perhaps the most underestimated factor is that the American public itself is no longer enthusiastic about endless tariff battles. Recent U.S. polling shows strong bipartisan support for preserving CUSMA because it keeps prices stable, protects American manufacturing, and prevents supply chain shocks. Corporate America has grown even more vocal. Manufacturers warn about rising production costs. Farmers fear losing export markets they fought to secure. Retail giants protest that ongoing tariff instability disrupts planning and keeps inflation high. At a moment when American households still struggle with elevated prices, another manufactured trade crisis is the last thing consumers want. The irony is unmistakable. Trump's threat to punish Canada now risks punishing the very voters he needs. And Canada knows that. When Ottawa hears Trump talking about blowing up the deal, it also hears the sound of U.S. political pressure closing in around him. Markets have a simple logic. Money flows towards stability. Trump's America, with its shifting tariffs and legal challenges, no longer offers that stability. Canada, under Carney, increasingly does. Businesses value rule of law environments where policies do not change by tweet or by courtroom drama. They look for governments capable of long-term planning. And they prefer supply chains that are predictable rather than politically explosive. Canada's clean energy tax credits, its industrial strategies for EVs and critical minerals, and its expanding Indo-Pacific partnerships all push in one direction, toward a more resilient economy, less vulnerable to U.S. turbulence. The result is a quiet but unmistakable trend. When Washington becomes unpredictable, Ottawa becomes attractive. What makes this shift even more significant is how foreign investors now talk about Canada. In private briefings, global firms describe the country not just as a safer alternative, but as a strategic hedge against U.S. volatility. They see a government capable of long-term thinking, a workforce aligned with future industries, and a political climate that rewards stability instead of theatrics. In a North America that feels increasingly divided between chaos and consistency, Canada is becoming the rational choice. And once capital begins moving toward stability, it rarely turns back. Trump thought threatening CUSMA would place Canada back on its heels. Instead, it revealed how much the landscape has changed. Canada is not the junior partner it once was. Mexico is no longer isolated. And the U.S. political climate, fractured, inflation-sensitive, and weary of tariff wars, now weakens Trump's leverage more than it strengthens it. If Washington continues down this path, North America may not be shaped by Trump's dominance, but by Canada's stability. The choice facing investors is becoming clearer: a volatile United States or a steady Canada building long-term partnerships. The real question is this: in a continent now defined by uncertainty on one side and confidence on the other, which future will businesses, workers, and global markets choose? The answer may already be forming.
He signed a $15 billion sweetheart subsidy deal with Stellantis, and now that same company, taking our tax dollars, the equivalent of $1,000 for every family in Canada, is shipping the jobs to the United States of America.
By the time time they ask question on this side of the House, every single member on this side, Mr. Speaker, we're fighting for Canada. We're fighting for auto industry. We're fighting for our workers. We're fighting to build Canada strong, Mr. Speaker. We should all join to defend our workers in the middle of a trade war. We don't need that kind of conservative politics. We need to stand up for Canada, build Canada strong. I believe in Canada, Mr. Speaker.
Canada wasn't blindsided. Despite the shouting matches in question period, despite Pierre Poilievre's theatrics, and despite Donald Trump's attempts to take a victory lap, the truth is quieter and far more inconvenient for Washington. Ottawa anticipated the risk long before Stellantis announced anything. They understood that Trump's second-term industrial pressure would test every multinational automaker operating in North America. And that is why the public version of the Stellantis contract contains redactions, not because the government is hiding incompetence, but because withholding certain details can preserve strategic flexibility, something any government needs in the middle of a continent-wide trade storm. So while headlines frame this as Stellantis shifting jobs to Illinois, the deeper story is that Canada had already built mechanisms to protect its interests if such a shift occurred. In October 2025, Stellantis confirmed its plan to move Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois. Trump immediately celebrated, calling the decision proof that his tariff and subsidy pressure was working. In Ottawa, Poilievre denounced the government for providing billions in support while allegedly failing to secure jobs. He repeatedly demanded the full unredacted contract. But the public version of the deal, like many large industrial contracts, contains sections withheld for confidentiality, a standard practice in both government procurement and commercial partnerships. And according to reporting from Reuters and Global News, the complete version is accessible only to members of a designated parliamentary committee, not to the broader public. Crucially, this entire political storm unfolded just as the federal government invoked formal dispute settlement proceedings against Stellantis. That move, independently confirmed by Reuters, shows that Canada believes it has enforceable obligations to defend and is prepared to use them. This is not the behavior of a government caught off guard. It is the behavior of a government acting on provisions it expected it might one day need. Opposition critics have framed the redactions as a cover-up, but several analysts and industry observers have suggested a more straightforward explanation. Redactions in industrial contracts are common because they contain commercially sensitive material, negotiation positions, or compliance frameworks that cannot be released without compromising future bargaining strength. While the precise contents of the redacted sections remain undisclosed, it is reasonable and consistent with standard practice to assume they may relate to performance obligations, investment conditions, or consequences tied to failing to meet agreed-upon targets. Nothing in public reporting contradicts the idea that such clauses could exist, especially because Canada initiated dispute proceedings only after Stellantis announced its shift. The key point is this: the redactions are not proof of wrongdoing. They are a sign that the contract contains binding material Canada does not want misinterpreted, weaponized, or exposed in the middle of an ongoing trade standoff. To understand why Stellantis made the move, we must understand Trump's broader strategy. His second-term trade doctrine is built around aggressive tariffs, including the revived 25% auto tariff, and a system of targeted subsidies designed to lure manufacturing into the U.S. Stellantis did not act out of ideology. It acted under pressure. Trump needed a symbolic reshoring win. Stellantis wanted to secure American incentives. The two priorities aligned. But neither Trump nor Stellantis controls the legal agreement governing the company's Canadian operations. Canada does. And that contract, whatever its full contents, is now the basis for Ottawa's formal challenge. Narratives can shift quickly, and Canada is now asserting its interpretation of the deal.
Since taking office in March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney has steered Canada toward a more self-reliant industrial strategy. His approach blends economic diversification with contractual enforcement. Canada has invested heavily in EV supply chains, battery manufacturing, and critical minerals, but Carney has repeatedly emphasized that public money must deliver public benefit. This philosophy explains Canada's rapid response to Stellantis. A government that expected no obligations would not launch dispute proceedings. A government that believed it had no leverage would not escalate the issue. Carney's background, leading both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, shapes his instincts. He understands leverage, risk, and negotiation dynamics. His government stance signals that Canada anticipated turbulence from Washington and built contracts robust enough to survive it. Canada is not reacting emotionally. Canada is executing structurally.
During question period, Poilievre repeated that investment is fleeing Canada and jobs are going to the U.S. But that framing omits the central fact. The Stellantis shift occurred amid deliberate U.S. distortion of the market through tariffs and subsidies. Canada did not cause this. Trump did. And Canada is not accepting it passively. Ministers emphasize that Canada is in the middle of a trade war, a line that reflects both the reality of U.S. policy and the government's intention to defend its position. The redactions may frustrate critics, but they also reinforce something essential. Canada retains tools that are not visible to the public, and that is precisely why they can be effective.
Canada's first step has already been taken, filing a formal dispute. That alone signals confidence in the strength of the contract. Next comes the financial component. If the dispute panel finds Stellantis in violation of its commitments, Ottawa has the right to freeze payments, seek reimbursement, or terminate portions of the deal. Beyond the legal dimension, Canada is doubling down on its domestic automotive strategy. Investments in battery plants, R&D clusters, and partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the EU continue to expand Canada's industrial footing. These alliances create alternatives to Trump-era volatility, and they raise the cost for companies that assume the U.S. is the only option. Diplomatically, Ottawa is aligning itself with other nations facing similar tariff pressure. In doing so, it transforms a bilateral problem into a multilateral one and reduces America's leverage in the long term.
At first glance, Stellantis' move looks like a symbolic defeat for Canada, but the moment you look beyond the surface, the picture changes. Canada anticipated the risk. Canada wrote agreements that allow it to respond, and Canada acted swiftly once the company revealed its intentions. Trump may enjoy the optics of a short-term win, but Ottawa still controls the contract, the dispute mechanism, and the industrial policy that shapes Canada's economic future. The real question now becomes, if Canada prepared this carefully for Stellantis, what other safeguards is Ottawa ready to deploy as the trade war intensifies?